And that's one of the things that just like really lies at sort of the essence of our conversation. It's really what makes a good life. And this is one of the things that Carl Jung concluded in his tremendous career, was that you can't come to a realization that somebody else came to, right? You must figure it out for yourself. You know, he talked about like the fact that religion itself has become dogmatic. And when you have religion, politics, all of these things, if they're dogmatic, then you're not going to be able to figure out your own spirituality. You're just going to hear it from someone else and you're going to call that spirituality.
Yeah. And that's, yeah, we all have to, each of us has to find it. And I must say that Carl Jung was the the master who appeared, when I finally was ready. I mean, he so guided me.
Yeah, I mean, he just, I've read many of his collected works. Like they blow my mind. Every time I read them, I actually read it like 4 pages at a time because that's all I can handle,
Yeah. Well, I remember when I first started reading it, I wasn't sure what I was reading, but I knew it was important and I just kept reading it. And I am so grateful for him because he was definitely a mentor of the first order.
And I was actually listening to one of your podcasts, a podcast that you were on, and you actually came to this conclusion. And it's so relevant to this conversation. You read Jung and you said, and correct me if I'm wrong on this, you read Jung and you, like millions of other people have, and he came up with these grand conclusions and they were so powerful and so meaningful. And you come to these realizations, but then you realize that some of the things in your actual life didn't line up perfectly. There were some things that your experiences kind of deviated from Jung, and some of his philosophies you kind of differentiated with. And that was your spiritual realization. That was you coming up with it yourself. Carl Jung or religion or politics or whatever, they were just a little jumping off point that really set you.
Yeah, it's right. Yes. And I think, there's a story Alan Watts used to tell that there were 2 great spiritual leaders in Japan. And when the first one died, he had exactly 12 disciples who were his followers. When the second one died, he had none. And he was the greater of the 2. Because if you're a real teacher, you don't have followers. They find their own way. They hear you, and then they go on their own way. And that's exactly what you're saying.
Yeah. That actually took me a while. That's funny. I like that because, you're right. Like Jesus's disciples, whatever, all these followers, they're followers, right? They're spreading the word of someone else. Mm-hmm. That's so interesting.
Yeah. And he said in the Nag Hammadi text, not to follow, but to be. And that would be the greater master.
Well, so that's the question that I think we've been trying to answer this whole time. And it blows my mind. And I don't know what to do about this. The question is, what is a good life, right? How could we determine what is a good life? Because one of the things that I realized is that somebody could live for 70 years in a materialistic, non-enjoyable world and, have a terrible life, all this stuff, family leaves them, like struggle with everything, completely alone, completely miserable, all of these things. And then for the last 10 years of their life, or the last 2 years on their deathbed, whatever, they come to this mighty spiritual realization. They accept death and they come together, they repent for their sins, and they say, I feel complete. But then there are the people who, live all 80 years of their life. They live a full life and they're spiritual the entire time, or, they make a lot of money or whatever, right? And they live a good life. Or the people who live for 60 years, live really well, and then fall off the path and say they didn't live a good life. So what really is it that allows for someone to have a good life and someone to not?
That allows for it? Yeah. I think we can have any kind of life practically, but it's what is only the individual can answer that. What is meaningful to you?
Yeah.
What do you want and choose to have in your life? And very often the things that come to us, for instance, in my case, with the deaths of everyone in my family in 3 different accidents, it was the decade of the greatest growth in my life. So yes, it brought a tremendous pain and grief, but that grief took me to a different place, a much wider understanding. And I think, first of all, it's what is the good life? Only the individual can answer. And certainly for you and for me, I think there has to be a great deal of meaning and connection and love and connection to a larger consciousness.
Well, that's the thing. Like, I spent years, like, I remember asking myself that question for years. And I read Dante's Divine Comedy, and one of the big things in Dante's Divine Comedy, Dante's Inferno, is that the people who are in purgatory, the people who are in this middle way between heaven and hell, all of them, or many of them, lived a terrible life, lived a life in which they were killing, it was brutal, they were in wars, they were soldiers, they did all of the worst things. But then in the moment when they get shot, and I forget the person's name, but this is one of the stories in there, he's laying on the ground about to die, and he says, God, I'm sorry. And he goes right up to purgatory. He doesn't go to hell. And it's like, I always thought of that as something that's just BS, right? I always thought of that as the person who lives an entire life and then just comes to some crazy spiritual realization at the end and then says they lived a good life. I always consider that some form of BS, but...
Well, at least at the end, they had a consciousness. And since consciousness continues, hopefully that will help them as they go along in their lives in another life, because it's really clear once we're in touch with that consciousness is that we keep creating lives. You know, there is reincarnation. Yeah. And that would help us in the next life if he has that realization at the end. But, you know, to live a whole life of killing and that kind, but, you know, one thing I think that I try to remember is that we can't really judge someone else's life. Yeah. We don't really know why it was why it happened that they lived that life and then had that at the end. But we can say, well, that's not what I want, you know, but maybe there were reasons that person had those experiences. But certainly we know what we want in our lives. You know, it's...
Well, that's the problem. It seems like everybody else carries some form of goal with them, which is different from ours. And that's the big thing that I struggle with my whole life, you know? Like, I seem to have come up with this sort of goal, right? This sort of, you know, life goal to sort of expand consciousness. Like, that's sort of my thing. And I've sort of landed there, you know, like that's the thing with Buddha, right? Buddha reached the 8th level of consciousness, whatever the hell that means, but he reached it.
That was a goal he had.
And, you know, like nobody knows what that means or whatever, but he reached it. And that's something akin to a saint. That's something akin to, you know, some crazy spiritual teacher, a shaman. Yet we could say that in our daily life, we're maybe on the 1st level of consciousness. Maybe some reach the 2nd, maybe a few trickle into the 3rd, you know, and a lot of that aligns with our goals. You know, if my goal is to make all the money in the world and then live a good life and live with freedom, right? Freedom's such a word that's thrown around in America. You know, hopefully I can make $1 billion and then live on a yacht and just like have no financial responsibility. Sure, that's great. Freedom probably gets you to the 2nd level, right? And quantifying it is probably the most ignorant thing I could do, but that's sort of conceptualized. Yeah. But I'm definitely starting to figure out, okay, you know what, where is the fulfillment? Where does the meaning come? Does it come from that higher level of consciousness, or can you get that meaning from money? Can you get that meaning from the material world? Can you get it from relationships? Like, that one doesn't resonate with me, or at least it's difficult.
Well, I think with relationships, that isn't in the same category perhaps as the money, but I think we can have money and use money. I think it's how we relate to money that makes the difference, you know. But I think everything is there. It's with how do we relate to ourselves, to the cosmic consciousness or that universal consciousness that we're part of. How do we relate to others? Are we able to really live in that deep relatedness of love and creativity? And then when we do, and it's so profoundly satisfying, we want to help others to do that, you know, and that becomes kind of a goal that there can be something other than a negativity or fighting or killing each other or lying to each other or trying to make money. That doesn't bring really deep satisfaction, and it destroys the person and the world.
Yes.
So what is the life that gives me meaning and makes me want to help others in whatever way I can? Not that they're not finding their own meaning, but to help them find their meaning or whatever, not to be superior in any way about it. We all will find our own, but we do see that it is that loving relatedness that makes us happy. You know, that's what really gives us joy. And even in the grief process, when those I loved were dead, were no longer in the physical world, there was that this experience of grief is like the other side of loving. I mean, it says something incredible about the human being, that we love so deeply that when that person is not here in the physical body, we think we'll die. That's a beautiful statement about how capable we are of love, that it means something, you know. But then grief will take us on a process in which we begin to realize, as Pishti said to his dad, birth and death are events in time and space. There is nothing but life.